We live in a time of transition. Many issues demand attention. There are three particular issues, intimately connected with each other, that are relevant to our conversation here this morning. The first is the fact of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. The second is the reaction to that fact. The reaction to that fact by representatives of the Catholic Church. The third is the systemic reality in which the fact and the reaction took shape. First, there was the discovery of the fact. It took us a while to assimilate this terrible truth. Then there was the discovery of the reaction. With some notable exceptions, the reaction was, at best, inadequate, and at worst, reprehensible. Our first instinct, it seems, was to cover up rather than own up. And one of the consequences of that was our disregard for the pain and suffering of the victims. We must ask why. Even allowing for the loss of perspective that so often accompanies hindsight, we must still ask certain questions. Why was our first instinct one of self-defense? Why were we so averse to the truth? Why did we not immediately ask, what about the victim? Is there anything about our self-understanding that might have aided and abetted the fact and our bad reaction to that fact? Such questions lead us to the third issue, the systemic reality. We Catholics need to look long and hard at ourselves and what we are in fact proposing as good news for the world. 50 years ago, the Second Vatican Council set in train this program of renewal. It remains very much unfinished business. In particular, we need to have an honest and informed conversation about sexuality. And that is the purpose of our gathering here today. As we engage in that conversation, I urge you to remember the link between conversation and conversion. The one thing that will make this a truly enriching event will be our openness to conversion, metanoia, whatever that might mean for us individually. Bishop Geoffrey Robinson will address us to facilitate that conversation. Geoff studied in Rome from 1955 through to 1965. He was ordained in Rome in 1960, a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney. His doctoral work was in canon law, though he has always maintained a scholarly interest in the study of sacred scripture. From 1967 until 1983, after a few years as a parish priest, he taught canon law at the Catholic Institute of Sydney. In addition to serving as Chief Justice of the Archdiocesan Marriage Tribunal, he was Secretary and then President of the Canon Law Society of Australia and New Zealand. In 1984, he published a book on marriage, divorce and annulment. A few years later, he published books on the Gospel of Mark and religious experiences in our everyday lives. More recently, he has published his book, Confronting Power and Sex in the Catholic Church, Reclaiming the Spirit of Jesus, in 2007, and Love's Urgent Longings, Wrestling with Belief in Today's Church, in 2010. For many years, Geoff served as the chairman of the Sydney Archdiocesan Catholic Schools Board and the Australian Catholic Education Commission, New South Wales. Finally, he worked extensively in the areas of ecumenism and professional standards in ministry. In 1984, he was named Auxiliary Bishop of Sydney, combining administrative work with his tribunal and other duties. In his work in the area of professional standards from 1994 to 2003, Geoff showed intelligent, courageous, and wise leadership in attempting to develop honest and constructive ways of dealing with the issues I have mentioned above. In particular, he was largely responsible for the Towards Healing process that was introduced in December 1996 and is widely followed both in Australia and abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Bishop Geoffrey Robinson.
I am well aware, as I start, of the sheer oddity that I, a celibate male, should be talking to you about sex. But I am also aware that the subject is so complex and so subtle that there is no one on the face of this earth who is really an expert of every aspect of it. And I'm talking about sexual morality within the Catholic Church. And on that subject, I think that I do have something to say. It's part of a much larger thing that I've been working on, looking at some of the really basic causes within the Church itself of the phenomenon of sexual abuse. And as I hope you'll see, teaching on sexual morality is one of those factors. I hope to show you that really the teaching on sexual morality is so, it's hard to find an adjective, so bizarre that false ideas can easily lead to false practice. And when put with many other different factors, this is one that we must confront if we wish to confront the scourge of abuse. The constantly repeated argument of the Catholic Church is that God created human sex for two reasons: as a means of expressing and fostering love between a couple, called the unitive aspect, and as the means by which new human life is brought into being, the so-called procreative aspect. The argument then says that the use of sex is, quote, according to nature, unquote, only when it serves both of these God-given purposes, and that both are truly present only within marriage, and even then, only when intercourse is open to new life, so that all other use of the sexual faculties is morally wrong. I have no problem with the idea that human sex has both a unitive and a procreative aspect, but I have four basic difficulties with the teaching that every single act of intercourse must contain both aspects. The first difficulty is that the Church is saying that the very essence of sexual sin is that it is a direct sin against God, because it is a violation of what is claimed to be the divine and natural order that God established. It is claimed that God inserted into nature itself the demand that every sexual act be both unitive and procreative. If it does not contain both of these elements, it is against nature as established by God. And to me, this raises two serious questions, one concerning nature and the other concerning God. In relation to nature, should we not conclude that if this divine and natural order exists in relation to our sexual faculties, it should also exist in many other areas of human life as well? So should not the Church's arguments concerning sex point to many other fields where God has given a divine purpose to some created thing, such that it would be a sin against God to use that thing in any other way? Why is it that it is only in relation to sex that this claim is made. I remember reading years ago the mocking argument that the God-given purpose of our eyes is to look forwards. That's why they're there in the front of our face. And therefore, rear vision mirrors in cars are against nature and therefore immoral. Now, granted that this is a mocking argument, does it not raise questions about what we mean by nature when we talk in this fashion, and how difficult it is to draw moral consequences from a claim to a divinely established nature? It is only in relation to sex that that statement is made, not that I am aware of about anything else in human life. The question concerning God. Imagine that you read in the newspaper 2 stories of Australians being physically attacked while overseas. Imagine that the first concerns a man who largely brought it on himself by getting drunk and getting into a fight. Imagine then that the second story concerns a woman who's not been drinking, has done nothing to provoke anyone, and whose name is Julia Gillard. Now, the second story would be by far the bigger story. There would be profuse apologies from the government of the nation where it occurred. And the reason would be the obvious one, that as Prime Minister of this country, she represents the country. And an unprovoked attack on her is an attack on the nation. We would all agree that this story is far bigger than the first one. In the same way, in past centuries, the argument was used that striking a king was far more serious than striking a commoner. And that would still be true today if someone actually physically attacked Queen Elizabeth. Everyone in Great Britain would be up in arms at this monstrous action against the Queen herself. In line with this, then, it was said that the greatest king by far is God. So an offence against God is far more serious than an offence against a mere human being. In this view, the most serious sins, therefore, were sins directly against God. Now that goes back to what I've already said. All sexual sins are seen as direct offences against God, and therefore they're all seen as most serious sins. This puts all sexual sins right up there with that other sin that is directly against God, namely blasphemy. And this helps to explain why in the Catholic Church sexual morality has long been given a quite exaggerated importance. For centuries, the Church has taught that every sexual sin is a mortal sin. There are no venial sins in this field. There are all sorts of phrases we were taught as in the seminary. There's no poverty of matter, no small matter here. They're all mortal sins. According to that teaching, even deliberately deriving pleasure from thinking about sex for 5 seconds is a mortal sin. The teaching may not be proclaimed aloud today as much as before, but it was proclaimed by many popes. It has never been retracted, and it has affected countless people. The teaching fostered belief in an incredibly angry God, for this God would condemn a person to an eternity in hell for a single unrepented moment of deliberate pleasure arising from sexual desire. Now, I simply do not believe in such a God. I positively reject such a God. If this were the only God on offer, I would be an atheist. My first rebellion against church teaching on sex came, therefore, not directly from a rejection of what the church said about sex, but a rejection of the God that this teaching presented. The parable of the prodigal son may help us here. The younger son had received the entire share of the property that would come to him, and he'd wasted it. He had no right to one further square centimetre of the property. He'd had his full share. Everything that remained belonged to the elder son. And this is the meaning of the words in the parable when the father says to the elder son, "You are with me always, and all I have is yours." That's literally true. Everything left will belong to the elder son. The father respected his elder son's rights and would take nothing from him. When, however, it came to the hurt that the prodigal son had caused to his parents by leaving, wasting the property, and coming back penniless, then the father brushed that aside out of love for his son and received him into the home as a son, not as a servant. He ordered that his ring be put on his finger, sandals on his feet, all the signs of sonship. The message is surely that God cares about the rights of human beings as the father cared about the rights of his elder son, and he cares about what human beings do to one another, but is big enough, loving enough, and forgiving enough not to get angry at direct offences against God. May we ask whether the God portrayed in this parable would condemn a person to eternal punishment for sometimes getting unitive and procreative purposes out of a perceived ideal harmony in the midst of the turbulence of sexuality. When a person takes great offence at even a trivial remark, we tend to speak of that person as a little person, while a person who can shrug off most negative comments we call a big person. And my reading of the Bible leads me to believe in a very big God indeed, who is not easily offended by direct offences. I believe, for example, that God shrugs off much of what is called blasphemy as an understandable human reaction to the felt injustice of evil and suffering in the world. I do not, for example, believe that God gets in the least offended when parents who have just lost a child rage in terrible anger against God. In this vein, I must ask whether God will be offended by any sexual thought or action considered solely as an offence against an order established by God, before any question of its effect on other persons, oneself, or the community is taken into account. I must add here that in the response to revelations of sexual abuse, the idea of every sexual sin as a direct mortal sin against God became a most serious problem. For far too many church authorities saw the offence of pedophilia primarily in terms of the mortal sin against God. This sexual sin was seen as the great mortal sin, far more serious than what was seen as the lesser sin against the minor. The mortal sin was to be treated according to the criteria governing all such sexual offences: repentance, confession, absolution, total forgiveness by God, and hence restoration to the status quo. This contributed greatly to the practice of moving offenders from one parish to another in the name of Christian forgiveness. And this was the teaching. It was all mortal sin, all sexual sin, but it was easily forgiven. And so this sexual sin could be just as easily forgiven as any other sexual sin. There was never going to be an adequate response to abuse as long as many people thought primarily in terms of sexual offences against God rather than harm caused to the victims. My second objection to the teaching is that the more you look at it, the more it appears to be an assertion rather than a proven fact. No one disputes the facts that sexual intercourse is the normal means of creating new life, and that it can and ought to be a powerful force in helping couples to express and strengthen their love. Both the unitive and procreative purposes are, therefore, foundational aspects of marriage as an institution of the human race. But are they essential elements of every individual marriage, no matter what the circumstances? For example, if a couple are told by medical experts that any child they had would suffer from a serious and crippling hereditary illness, are they going against God's will if they decide to adopt rather than have children of their own? Beyond this, are the unitive and procreative elements essential in every single act of sexual intercourse? And if so, on what basis? There are always problems when human beings claim that they know the mind of God. So is the statement that it is God's will, and indeed order, that both the unitive and procreative aspects must necessarily be present in each act of sexual intercourse, a proven fact or a simple assertion? If it's claimed to be a proven fact, what are the proofs? Why do church documents not present such proofs? Would not any proofs have to include the experience of millions of people in the very human endeavour of seeking to combine sex, love, and the procreation of new life in the midst of the turbulence of human sexuality and the complexities of human life? Is an ideal being confused with a reality? If it is only an assertion, is there any reason why we should not apply the ancient principle of logic? What is freely asserted may be freely denied. If it is no more than an assertion, does it really matter who makes the assertion or how often it is made? Where are the arguments in favour of the assertion that would convince an open and honest conscience? The third objection is that the teaching of the Catholic Church is to far too great an extent based on a consideration as what is seen as the God-given nature of the physical acts in themselves, rather than on how such acts affect persons and relationships. Moral questions are then concerned solely with the details and circumstances of the physical acts, rather than of the persons performing them. And the Church continues to do this at a time when the whole trend in moral theology is in the opposite direction. As a result, the Church gets into impossible difficulties in analysing physical acts without a context of human relations. For example, and it was this which I must say had a very profound effect on my own thinking. But as an example, some married couples find that there is a blockage preventing the sperm from reaching the ovum, but that in a simple procedure, a doctor can take the husband's sperm and insert it into the wife in such a way that it passes the blockage and enables conception. But the Vatican condemned this action because the physical act was not seen as integral. Now, surely to God, that couple were trying hard to have both the unitive and procreative elements in their marriage. Surely that's exactly what they were doing. But once we get all our concentration on the integrity of the physical act and don't think about the persons, we're going to get into this kind of difficulty. My fourth objection is that the entire idea of the necessity for both the unitive and procreative element in each act of intercourse is not based on anything that Jesus said or even implied, but comes from philosophical ideas concerning acts that are said to be natural and acts that are said to be against nature. Sexuality concerns a most powerful and important force in human life. In seeking to understand its moral nature, why would the Church not turn to anything Jesus said or did and rely instead solely on philosophical ideas concerning the natural and unnatural that come from other sources? So my four objections are, firstly, that it sees all sexual sin as a direct sin against God, and that creates difficulties. Secondly, it is an assertion, and it doesn't matter how often it's repeated, it's still an assertion and may be freely denied. Thirdly, it gets all caught up in the integrity of the physical act rather than consider the persons performing the act. And fourthly, it's not based on the Gospels or on anything Jesus said or did. We are left with the fact, therefore, that the Catholic Church is propounding a teaching that only a minority of Catholics, I believe, still accepts, especially among the young, where I think sometimes it's down to about 2%. Western society as a whole has rejected this teaching and gone to a position that is in many ways an opposite extreme. Few people, it seems, are left to argue for a middle ground between the two extremes. And it is that middle ground that I now wish to explore. So far, I have been criticizing the traditional teaching of the Church on this subject. I now want to explore not an opposite extreme, and I think in some ways Western society has gone to an opposite extreme. I want to explore a middle ground. If we decide to leave behind an ethic that sees sex in terms of direct offences against God, that emphasises individual physical acts rather than persons and relationships, that is not based on the Gospels, and that is based instead on a repeated assertion rather than an argument, where should we go? I suggest that the answer is that we should move to an ethic that, firstly, sees any offence against God as being brought about not by the sexual act in itself, but by the harm caused to human beings. Secondly, speaks in terms of persons and relationships rather than physical acts. Thirdly, looks to the Gospels and the person of Jesus for its inspiration. And then fourthly, builds an argument on these three foundations rather than on unproven assertions. So firstly, harm to persons. If it is impossible to sustain an entire sexual ethic on the basis of direct offences against God, all the evidence tells us that God cares greatly about human beings and takes a very serious view of any harm done to them through sexual desire or any other cause. As the Gospel of Mark says, if any of you put a stumbling block before one of these little ones who believe in me, it would be better for you if a great millstone were hung around your neck and you were thrown into the sea. Granted, the deliberate Semitic exaggeration in these words? Does not this quotation tell us what God thinks of pedophilia? Does it not also tell us that Jesus puts the emphasis on the harm done to the victim rather than on some direct offence against God? Or take the quotation from Matthew's Gospel. Then they will answer, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger or naked, or sick or in prison, and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. In these two quotations, Jesus identifies with the weakest persons in the community and tells us that any harm done to them is harm done to him. I suggest, therefore, that we should look at sexual morality in terms of the good or harm done to persons and the relationships between them, rather than in terms of any direct offence against God. Following from this, may we say that sexual pleasure, like all other pleasure, is in itself morally neutral, neither good nor bad. If you eat a nice meal, it's pleasurable, and that's not particularly good or bad in itself, in itself alone. So is it rather the circumstances affecting persons and relationships that make this pleasure good or bad? For example, a good pleasure for a married couple seeking reconciliation after a disagreement, a bad pleasure for a man committing rape. To take this further, if we go beneath the particular teachings of the Catholic Church on sex and come to its most foundational beliefs, I suggest that there is a very fundamental point on which the Church and modern Western society appear to be moving in opposite directions. The Church is saying that love is the very deepest longing of the human heart, the basis of all our other longings. And sex is one of the most important expressions of love that we have. So people should do all in their power to ensure that sex retains its ability to express love as deeply as possible. They should, therefore, make sure that sex does not become so trivialized for themselves individually or for the community as a whole that it loses its power to express the deepest love. Modern society, on the other hand, has become more and more accepting of casual sexual activity that is not related to either love or relationship. In its simplest terms, the Church is saying that because love is all important and because sex is so vital a way of expressing love, sex is always serious, while modern society appears to be saying more and more that sex is a bit of fun and not in itself serious. I remember being struck by a film on television a year or so ago in which a man says to a woman, "Shall we have sex or a hamburger?" Well, it's only a film. I won't draw big conclusions from it. On this point, I find myself instinctively more in sympathy with the views of the Church than with those of modern society. For me personally, it was in fact the effects of sexual abuse on minors more than anything else that convinced me that sex is always serious. When you see what one sexual act can do to a minor for a lifetime. Because I see sex as serious, I do not simply conclude that all sex is good as long as it does not harm anyone. I would never want to put the matter in those simple terms, for I have seen far too much harm caused by this attitude. The idea is expressed in negative terms, do not harm, and it inevitably contains within itself the serious risk of brinkmanship. That is, that with little thought for the good of the other person involved, one may seek one's own pleasure, and in doing so may go right up to the very brink of causing harm to another. In a field as turbulent as this, countless people basing themselves on such a principle will go over that brink. Jesus never said, "Do no harm to your neighbour." He invariably said, "Love your neighbour." And this implies more than the negative fact of not harming. It implies genuine respect for the other and positively wanting and seeking the good of the other. The essential difference between the two is that an attitude of do not harm can put oneself first, while love your neighbour must put the neighbour first. And to me, a Christian ethic must at the very least be expressed in these positive terms. It is only on this positive basis of respecting and seeking the positive good of the other that I believe we could feel confident of having found a truly Christian ethic. We could never have that confidence on the basis of the negative principle of do not harm. And in doing this, we must take the harm that can be caused by sexual desire very seriously indeed, and look carefully at all the circumstances that can make morally bad the seeking of sexual pleasure because they involve harm to others or even to oneself or to the community. Some of these factors are the obvious ones: violence, physical or psychological, deceit and self-deceit, harming a third person, for example, a spouse, using another people for one's own gratification, treating people as sexual objects rather than persons, separating sex from love to the extent that sex loses its ability to express the depths of love, trivializing sex so that it loses its seriousness, allowing the desire for present satisfaction to restrict the ability to respond to the deeper longings of the human heart, harming the possibility of permanent commitment, failing to respect the connection that exists between sex and new life, failing to respect the need to build a relationship patiently and carefully, failing to respect the common good of the whole community. It will be seen from all of this that I do have most serious difficulties with the idea that anything goes. In reacting against one extreme, there is always the danger of going to the opposite extreme. I believe that this is what many people have done in relation to sex. One has to add it was precisely because I believe the Catholic Church's teaching is so extreme in one direction that it almost inevitably causes people to go to the opposite extreme. The teaching of Jesus, then, the major criterion of sexual morality that Jesus gave us was his universal principle of love your neighbor. He presented this principle as the basis of everything in the Christian life. And this means that, like any other act in a Christian's life, a sexual act should be based on a genuine desire for all that is good for the other person rather than simply on self-interest. Since we may assume that he was not naive about either the good or the harm that sexual desire can cause, we must conclude that having said this, having given this principle of love your neighbor, he believed that he had said all that needed to be said. In this, the Church has definitely not followed his example. I suggest, therefore, that the central questions concerning sexual morality are we moving towards a genuinely Christian ethic if we base all our sexual thoughts and actions on a profound respect for the relationships that give meaning, purpose, and direction to human life, and on loving our neighbour as we would want our neighbour to love us? Within this context, may we ask whether a sexual act is morally right when positively it is based on a genuine love of neighbour, that is, at a genuine desire for what is good for the other person involved, rather than solely on self-interest, and negatively contains no damaging elements such as harm to a third person, any form of coercion or deceit, or any harm to the ability of sex to express love. Is the question of when these circumstances might apply, and whether and to what extent they might apply both inside and outside marriage, one for discussion and debate by both the church community and the wider community, and for decision and responsibility before God, other people, and one's deeper self by each individual. Would you mind if I repeat that? Are we moving towards a genuinely Christian ethic if we base all our sexual thoughts and actions on a profound respect for the relationships that give meaning, purpose, and direction to human life, and on loving our neighbour as we would want our neighbour to love us? Within this context, may we ask whether a sexual act is morally right when positively it is based on a genuine love of neighbour, that is, a genuine desire for what is good for the other person involved, rather than simply on self-interest, and negatively contains no damaging elements. Is the question of when these circumstances might apply, and whether and to what extent they might apply both inside and outside marriage, one for discussion and debate by both the church community and the wider community, and for decision and responsibility before God, other people, and one's own deeper self by each individual. Let me here give the briefest possible answer to some of the questions that then might be asked. Adultery. It would be very hard to justify adultery under the ideas that I have presented, for there would surely always be the breaking of a solemn promise on which another is building his or her life, and there would always be the gravest danger of harm to that other. I do recognize, however, that some marriages can be very dead. And there is always the special circumstance. The case became famous in Eastern Europe under communism. A man was arrested and, going on what normally happened, would have disappeared forever. His wife went to the general who held him and begged for his release. She was an attractive woman, so the general said, "I'll release him if you'll have sex with me." Now, on his part, this is truly a mortal sin. Yes, it's a total exclusion of God. On her side, she's been put in an impossible dilemma. And I believe that God would happily and freely accept whatever decision she made. Premarital sex. I would always like to see a couple carefully build their relationship on a solid foundation of friendship and mutual interests, rather than being caught up too quickly in the intoxication of sex. But I recognize, on the other hand, that the closer they get to the marriage, the more intimacy there will and should be. I would at least like them to think about the implications of a full sexual relationship rather than just fall into it or feel that there is something wrong with them if they don't. Masturbation. My questions would be along these lines. Is it simply part of the normal search for identity of an adolescent? In an adult, is it an act of needed self-love and affirmation? Or on the other hand, is it part of a turning in on oneself and the avoidance of relationships with others? Is it becoming addictive? Homosexual sex. I believe that the ideas I have suggested apply equally to homosexual sex. I would like to see state recognition of formal unions between gay persons, but I still wonder whether these unions could be called by some new name rather than be called marriage. I'm aware here that the ancient Romans had a number of different words. There was matrimonium, which was matrimony, but they also had words like consortium, confarreatio, contubernium, and they described other kinds of unions that were relevant to them. For example, I think the confarreatio was a union between a free person and a slave, and it was a recognized union. The slave never did, because they were slaves, not for any other reason, didn't acquire the same rights, but it was, different things were given different names. And I would love to see gay people come up with a name, for their union, which would be fully recognized. But I would prefer them to leave the word marriage alone, leave that to heterosexual couples. Concerning adoption, I would follow the principle that the good of the child is always paramount. Everything gives way to that. Does that exclude homosexuals? No. Take this case. Two parents are killed in a car accident. They have two little children. The wife's sister is well known to the children, a beloved aunt, and they would fit very naturally into her home. And the fact that she might be a lesbian in a lesbian relationship wouldn't change that fact. So I would happily allow those two children to go to their aunt and be brought up by her. Conclusion. Many would object that what I have proposed would not give clear and simple rules to people. But God never promised us that everything in the moral life would be clear and simple. Morality is not just about doing right things, let alone is it just about obeying laws. It is also about struggling to know what is the right thing to do. Many would also object that the ideas I have presented would be too easily abused and would lead to people doing whatever they wanted to. Well, yes, of course the ideas would be abused, for sexual desire is a most powerful force, and for that very reason, any moral framework on this subject will be abused, just as Catholic teaching has been abused and ignored. But morality is not just about doing what everyone else around us is doing. It is about taking a genuine personal responsibility for everything we do. And sexual morality is about being profoundly sensitive to the needs and the vulnerabilities of the people with whom we interact. It is through this sensitivity that we will grow as moral persons in a way that mere obedience to authority can never make us grow. I believe that there is normally a far better chance of a sexual act meeting the requirements I have suggested within a permanent vowed relationship than there is outside such a relationship. But I could not draw the simple conclusion that inside a vowed relationship everything good, outside everything bad. The complexities of human nature and the turbulence of sexuality do not allow for such simple answers. Ultimately, we must come to personal responsibility, with all its difficulties and dangers, but also with all its potential for growth. The encyclical Humane Vitae of 1968 was a genuine watershed in the relationship between papal teaching and Catholic people. And I cannot see the slightest possibility of the Catholic people as a whole ever returning to the current hierarchical teaching on sexual morality. If the gap between the two is to be bridged, it must be on the basis of mutual acceptance of a middle ground. I hope that I have pointed in fruitful directions. Thank you.
Last weekend, Malcolm Turnbull had an article in the Sydney Morning Herald about gay marriage. And I was just wondering if you read the article, would you care to comment on it?
I didn't read the article, no. I did see him on Q&A that Monday, which he referred to that article, and yeah, he was somewhat dismissive, I felt, of those who would look for a new word and said, of course it's no problem, it won't cause any harm to marriage.
The main thrust of his article last Saturday was that gay marriage was not so much, could be a stumbling block to, or would bring down our concept of marriage, but rather it was a lack of commitment and fidelity in the community that was the threat to marriage.
He said that on Q&A as well. I mean, he's right in the sense that, well, there are many, many factors involved in marriage breakdown. Lack of commitment. I think with many, many young people, it's fear of permanent commitment that's the factor. Yeah, I mean, yes, we need to look at those factors when we're talking about marriage. But when we talk about gay unions, I think my question's still valid. Is there I'm not going to suggest a new name, you know why? Because if I ever did, everyone would jump on that name. And whereas the idea behind it, I think, still needs, I think it's gay people themselves who would have to come up with a name. But, if we could come up with an acceptable name, then I would certainly be completely in favour of gay civil unions.
Thank you, Bishop. I'm a gay man who was in a straight marriage for 27 years, so I think I know a little bit about marriage. And I have been campaigning for marriage equality. And to one of the parliamentarians in Canberra, when I went down there, he said, well, he believes that marriage is a sacrament. And my response to him was that when I marry a man this time, that will be as sacramental as my first marriage. And I guess my question is, for you, Bishop, is would Jesus have insisted that we make up another name?
Well, the question is always asked, but I cannot tell you what Jesus would have done on a whole series of subjects. Jesus was, yes, so compassionate, but also very challenging to people, really challenging. And so, quite what he would say, I wouldn't even begin to know there. I'm not absolute in the statements I make. I'm still searching on this subject. I am in favour of recognised gay unions. I don't, this is to me ultimately a basic matter of civil rights, that there should be such unions. But I don't want to see that hurt what we have, heterosexual unions. And I still feel until someone convinces me otherwise, I still feel the best solution would be two different words. I haven't yet heard a good argument as to why a different word would be, totally unsatisfactory, why it has to be the one word marriage.
Bishop Robinson, I'd just like to ask you, today we've spoken about pedophilia and sexuality, but one of the difficulties, I think, with the church is that it hasn't really been in solidarity with people over so many issues, and it doesn't seem to understand the underlying morality of being, how can I put it, of the whole lot of issues that affect people and their responsibility or their opportunity to help people in a whole range of issues. Like, we're looking today at all the consequences of pedophilia, but in 10 and 20 years' time, will we ask ourselves why the church didn't have conversation, have negotiation, have discussion, because of the consequences we will see in 20 years' time for things that are happening today? Can you understand what my underlying question is?
I'm understanding you to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel that the church is out of touch, not just on this one issue of sexual morality, but on a whole series of issues?
That's out of touch because they won't negotiate, they won't discuss, they want to put their opinions out on people and people to follow them without any willingness to discuss with the people concerned.
Yeah. Yes. I said at the very beginning that the paper I've given today is a development of part of another study that I'm doing, looking for the causes of abuse within the church. And I hope that now you can see why I consider this one of them. These ideas are very unhealthy. And if you're brought up on that and you live that, and most of the offenders, as you well know, are historical cases. That is, they were, people brought up years ago with this teaching very strongly drummed into them. And it's unhealthy, and it leads to unhealthy actions. But it's not alone. There are many other things. And some of them are the ones, the book that I wrote is Confronting Power and Sex, because I think they're the two subjects above all on which change is absolutely needed. And the power one is what you're talking about, consulting with people, listening to them, a more dialogue church. Instead of, no, they're not putting out their opinions, they're far more than opinions, aren't they? They're putting out sort of dogmas almost on...
They're putting out their assertions.
Yeah, well...
Like, to give you an example, in the example of ethics, which I'm not a teacher, it doesn't have any personal interest to me. But if we looked at the level of violence, certainly it seemed that there was it either had to be scripture or ethics. But wouldn't the church have been able to negotiate that there were ethics? Little children today need to learn ethics. There is an incredible escalation of violence in our society.
Yes, well, there is. I'm not sure that learning ethics will necessarily, of its own, change that. But, yes, there are many fields in which we need to work. This is only one of them. I'm not pretending otherwise. The fundamental one, I think, I've already been speaking heresy this morning, so let me speak another one. The fundamental problem to me is papal infallibility. There, I've said it. Why? Because that is the reason why we can't even discuss these matters. Sexual morality is one, the ordination of women, can't talk about it. All sorts of other questions that come up, can't talk about them. Plus, a thing called putting orthodoxy before orthopraxis. That is, orthodoxy is right beliefs, orthopraxis is right actions. And in the church, right beliefs are seen as far more important than right actions. Wrong actions can be easily forgiven. But if you have the wrong belief, oh no. So that the classic example occurred in the United States, where they've had gross pedophilia and gross mismanagement of it. And nobody's ever been excommunicated, but a nun in a hospital who was faced with an acute dilemma when there was a mother giving birth, she had other children, and the doctors said, we cannot save both mother and child. We cannot. If we possibly could, we'd do so, but we just can't. In other words, that baby is going to die. There's nothing medical science can do to save it. But if we don't intervene, the mother will also die. And then the other children will have no mother. And the nun said, in those circumstances, abort. And she was excommunicated promptly. Now, that's, to me, typical of this, yes, orthodoxy comes before orthopraxis. No matter what you've done, no matter how bad a pedophile you've been, that can all be forgiven easily. Well, Jesus said, by this shall all people know that you are my disciples, that you love one another. In other words, your actions. Jesus did not say, by this shall all people know that you are my disciples, that you all recite the same creed. Now, I'm not despising creeds. Creeds are important. They have their place. But it's not the criterion. It's our actions that count, whereas the church has been too much on the beliefs.
Geoff, these will be two comments. I'm a civil marriage celebrant, and I'd say by quick calculation, 96% of the couples that I've married are already living together. And I recall a comment that an old Redemptorist priest made about 15 years ago at a mission that he gave at our church, actually. He said, some marriages begin before the wedding, some marriages begin at the wedding, and some marriages don't even begin after the wedding. And I think that, to me, was a wise thing to say. And I guess the fact is, we'd probably have to say, because 2/3 of marriages today are civil weddings, only 1/3 are done by religious weddings. So most weddings and most marriages have begun in that sense before the wedding. And the other comment about gay marriage, I think that underlying gay people's, there's an underlying need to be treated like everyone else in the community. And I honestly believe that hell will freeze over before they will accept some other word instead of the word marriage. This is just my understanding. I'm not gay, but my understanding is that gay people want to be accepted as just like everybody else, and to say to them, well, we value your commitment, but it would be good if you had another name instead of marriage. I think they'll just reject that forever, because to them it's saying, in my understanding, you still are different. You still are different. And they cannot accept that. So they will never accept anything else except the word marriage. That's my understanding. Okay.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not absolute on the subject, and you are profoundly right that is the reason why they want that word, because they feel that anything else would just not, would never make them equal, and they want equality. That means it's a very, very difficult question. I want them to be equal. I want them to have equal rights within the community. There's no simple answer, is there? And your first question, if a couple live together, I'm not sure it's correct to say that their marriage has begun. To me, marriage is when, or an essential part of it, is when you make that public commitment before the community. From this day on, we two are husband and wife. We are married. So it's the public commitment is an essential part of it. So I would prefer that couples who simply live together, we do not refer to them as a de facto marriage. Again, they're taking a word to which I don't think they're entitled. And by their own choice in this case, they did not want that public commitment, and yet to me that's an essential part of marriage.
This is a related question, and I want to stress that I'm not making debating points. I'm genuinely looking, searching. Notwithstanding the fact that part of my baggage is 4 years of moral theology at Manly Seminary under Jimmy Madden and Tom Connolly, enlightened, I might say, by a very interesting young canon lawyer at the time, late 60s. I agree. Your logic in terms of morality is overwhelming. My question is, have you given consideration to the sacramental theology? And I'm thinking of St. Paul's words, quoting Genesis, male and female they are made in the image of God. For this reason, man shall leave mother and father and cling to his wife. This is a great mystery. I'm saying it applies to Christ and his church. Yeah. This is a question that I find very challenging.
Yeah. Once you go back into history and into the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, but also the New, you're into a different world, and you have to, what exactly was Paul condemning when he spoke about homosexuality? See, in the ancient world, the normal belief, so far as I can tell, till I'm proved to be wrong, is that the assumption was simply that everyone was heterosexual. Therefore, homosexual acts were a free choice of homosexual acts by heterosexual people. And that was, Paul couldn't get his mind around that and condemned it. When you go way back into the Old Testament, again, similar ideas were present. You have to be very careful of language. The Old Testament calls homosexuality an abomination, but it uses the word 138 times of many different things, including, for example, eating prawns. Well, it says that animals are clean when they have fins and tails, and if they don't, they're not clean. And it calls eating anything that's not that, an abomination. So prawns and lobster are an abomination. For anybody to stand up today and say homosexuality is an abomination, the Bible says so, is quite wrong. If they were being very logical, they'd need to go down to the local Chinese restaurant and say anyone who's eating prawns is guilty of an abomination before. So we've got to be very careful once we get back to Scripture and ancient times.
I accept that absolutely about the strictures in the Old Testament, particularly about homosexuality. Not addressing that. The question that I'm interested in is the parallel, the sacramental parallel that Paul draws between union of man and wife and Christ and church. That sacramental similarity.
Could that ever be extended to a homosexual union? Well, firstly, I think we need to change the entire sexual morality. Once you did, and we're looking at everything in a completely new light as a result, I believe it might lead you to that conclusion, that their union could be sacramental too. I'm not giving final answers on anything today, but you're asking me, and I certainly wouldn't want to exclude that idea.
Thank you, Bishop. You mentioned about the importance or the fact of us looking for, or our church looking for, at the causes of the paedophilia crisis. I'm just wondering if you would say a little bit more about the preparedness to do that and at what levels it's happening.
Can you say the first bit again? I didn't catch.
Looking at the causes for the paedophilia crisis in our church.
Yes.
And who is doing this? Is it happening? And the preparedness to do that, and at what sort of levels is that happening?
Who's doing it is not, certainly at any level up there, it's not happening. It's the great, great crying need. Very slowly, there was some response to abuse. But if you look at the Vatican, it's been the slowest, I have to say. At first it dismissed it as an Anglo-Saxon problem. Then, when it couldn't any longer do that, it tended to dismiss it as a homosexual problem. And then when it couldn't any longer do that, it started to admit that there might just be such a thing called pedophilia, in many different places. It hit Europe, and that was very significant. There began to be somewhat better responses to individual cases. Lots of nice words, some good actions. When Pope Benedict was here in Sydney and he met with a group of homosexuals, he met with a group of victims. And those who were present, I was not present, those who were present tell me he did well. There was one, they had it upstairs, and one at the last moment couldn't come up and sat on the stairs. And I'm told the Pope went down and sat beside him. But that's fine. But what I've been crying for a long, long time, confront, not manage, confront. And that means confront the causes. Now, the ones I'm talking about at the moment are things like this. Firstly, the angry God. The long history there of that angry God. And an angry God you've got to placate above all. Once you tie that in with the mortal sin business of sex, sex led to a really horrendously angry God. So we've got to address that, and no beautiful statement about a loving God will do it. It's got to have its effect in the way a million different things are done within the church. That's the very first one. Sexual morality, I'm not going to remember the lot. The male church, the fact that women have had no say in any of this. The celibate church, the fact that even most of the men get no say. It's only the celibate ones who do. And believe me, only a few of them. So all of that, the orthodoxy versus orthopraxis, clericalism, that thing of clerics being somehow up above the rest of humanity, that saying of from the letter to the Hebrews, that God, the Latin phrase was ex hominibus assumptus, taken up from among human beings, which was never what the Greek said. The Greek said simply taken from among human beings. In other words, you've got 100 human beings there, one becomes a teacher, one becomes a doctor, one becomes a priest. But it was Jerome translated that as ex hominibus assumptus, assumed, taken up. And that thing of priests being superior to others and up above others, that's fatal. We've got to change that. And everybody has to assist in that. Believe me, I know any number of cases where priests have tried to climb down off the pedestal, and it wasn't just superiors, it was Catholic people who told them to get right back up there. We want you up on a pedestal, in other words. And it's very hard to climb down. That has to change. Professionalism. In most professions these days, there is a periodic and serious appraisal. There is none for priests. Now, I've tried to introduce it, but I couldn't get any bishop to make it obligatory, so it remained a free choice. And guess what happened? Those who least needed it did it. Those who most needed it wouldn't have a bar of it. So some did, but really they were the best of the priests who did it. Then I turned to those which were preventing a good response to abuse, and their papal authority is the big one. See, papal authority means you can't talk about the morality of sex. You can't talk about the ordination of women. Nowadays, the latest one is you can't even talk about original sin. People now have problems with the idea of original sin because there were no original parents. I mean, Adam and Eve is a story, right? It's not, and what you find in the first chapters of Genesis is not a factual account of what happened. It's a story. But you can't talk any of these things. You come back to papal authority, and it's not just the formally infallible ones. You cannot question in practice anything in which a pope has invested serious papal authority. And sex is a classic case where he's invested massive papal authority. So you can't question it, which means, one of the things I've been saying for a long time now is we have to start from sexual abuse, look at causes, and follow wherever the argument leads. And I've been told again and again you can't do that because you can't question these solemn, teachings of the church. You're just not allowed to look at those. And that includes, as I said, not just the infallible ones. It includes, say, things like clerical celibacy. You can't question that because too much papal authority has been invested in it.
Then, in other words, we all agree that this needs to be looked at. And I'm looking at the title of today's your talk today, which says, "Can we bridge the gap?" Doesn't leave me with very much hope in that.
The other talk, the broader one I've given, with looking at these different causes, the title of that was "Changing the Culture," because that's what we need to do. We need to change some very fundamental things in the Catholic culture.
Bishop Geoffrey, firstly, thank you for this enlightening conversation. After listening to your words, I didn't realise how big a sinner I was. And since I'm past the age of being able to procreate, every time I have intercourse, that means I'm committing a mortal sin.
No.
And
They've
all
got
these
that
mortal
one
sinners
covered,
here.
Sorry?
All the mortal sinners here.
You see, they would say you're not excluding procreation.
Well, if I'm past it,
and
then
therefore, I know, but they're saying you're not excluding it.
Well,
and there's nothing wrong with the physical act.
But if I can't have children, then I don't pass the B test.
No. They would not say that, in fairness to them. But, your earlier bit about sort of the many mortal sins, yes, this is real. I've met many people who said, I can't live that morality, not even think about sex. And they lose the courage to continue and say it's hopeless. Even people have said, well, look, if thinking about sex is a mortal sin and doing it is a mortal sin, I might as well do it. You think I'm joking? Oh, no, I'm not. You can see the logic of that if they feel they really can't live up to the basic, there's mortal sins everywhere. You're crossing a minefield with mortal sins. Any moment you're going to step on one. And that's a gross inflation of the currency of mortal sin.
Thank you very much once again. But actually, I'm looking around the audience and I was looking for anybody under 40. What are we worried about here? Because we're not going to be around because there won't be much of a church. Under 40s couldn't give a damn, they're not here. But the reason I sort of give a damn in a way is because I do believe we need God. We need His love in our life. I have a gay niece. And I don't think it was just because of the gayness of the particular niece, but none of that family now has anything to do. I haven't had the guts to actually ask them if they believe in God or it's just the Catholic Church. But that's one of the reasons I'm sort of here, because I think there needs to be a future, but sort of look around because most of the young people are not practising anyway, and they're not here and they couldn't give a damn, otherwise they would be here. Anyhow, I don't know. I'm just making a comment, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Yes, I'm sort of. I can see the audience too, of course. In fairness, there could be some younger people, but they are out with their kids at some sports morning, aren't they? Any sort of younger people these days, it's a Saturday, and yet it's hard to find any day which would be suitable. We've over this issue of sex, we've lost an enormous number of young people. I'm only saying the obvious. If it weren't for the migrants, our church would be down in the basement somewhere in this country. The migrants, not only in Australia but in a number of countries, are sort of keeping it alive. We've lost an enormous number over sex-related issues. Not only these, others we haven't even mentioned today, things like divorce. We've lost an enormous number of people. There is a crying need, I believe, to look again from the very beginnings. See, where does all this come from? It comes, as far as I can tell, it comes from, there was a gentleman by the name of Philo of Alexandria. He was a contemporary of Paul, so virtually contemporary of Jesus. And he was a Jew living in Alexandria, so outside Israel. And he found that a number of the pagans there were interested in the Jewish religion, but balked at the purity laws. So he tried to explain them in rational terms. And he came up with this idea that there was natural sex and unnatural sex. And he used language of his time, which we'd find, not according to our taste. He said that having sex with a menstruating woman was like sowing seed in a swamp, and he said that having homosexual sex was like sowing in a desert, so his language. But he was the one who seems to have introduced this concept of natural and unnatural. And various church leaders like Jerome and co. listened to him and took it over. So it goes back an awfully long way. Remember, it's also based on the idea that only changed in the last 2 centuries, I'm right, I think, that when ovulation was discovered. Before that, it was thought that the man was the active agent and the woman was simply the field in which the seed was sown. And it was even believed that inside each tiny little sperm there was an homunculus, a little man. And it was then sown within the as it were, the soil of the woman, and there grew. So it's only, so it's against all that background. But there's a crying need for it to be looked at again. But is it going to happen? I wish.
Can I just turn the question a little bit away from sex for 1 second? I promise not to do it. I want to ask you a question about education because it fascinates me. Working class kid from the western suburbs, first generation to get a university education, only because of the generosity of great nuns and brothers. The church has invested an enormous amount in educating us and continues to do so. And it now has, I think, a laity which is still made up of a lot of people who are passionate about our faith and want to be heard on it. But increasingly, I think we feel that there's not all, but a lot of the hierarchy that doesn't want to talk to us and doesn't want to listen to us. It's bizarre to me that our church has had this great success in education and the products are now being disregarded.
Yeah. The way I put it more succinctly was the church taught us how to think and then told us not to. Yes, the church has invested a vast amount in education. As for bishops, most of the people I know as bishops are basically decent human beings. Most of them are, that's not much to say, is it? But most of them are. Most of them would like to listen. Partly it's the problem of, sheer time and listening to everybody. Partly it's fear, because they're afraid that you're promptly going to bring up things that they can't change anyway. It's all back with the Pope. He alone could bring some of these things in. So if you confront them, I would say what we've been talking about today, sexual morality needs to change. What does the bishop do or say to you? He could, of course, come out and say, yes, I agree entirely with you. Then there's the fear that he's instantly delated to Rome. And that's a very real fear, by the way. Can anybody guarantee that there are no plants in the audience today? You can't, can you? And every word I say could be taken down on a machine and be in Rome within a week. So bishops are scared to say what they actually believe on a number of subjects. And that's a sad situation.
Which is the subject that I wanted to come to, Bishop Jeff Robinson, which is about the fact that something that troubles me greatly is what do we do for the future? You are someone who has given us hope over the years, you and other very brave members of this church, religious, many of them, who have given us hope, and I think we all want to walk away from here today with a feeling of hope. But the problem for us is we in our church today, in Australia, in Sydney, have a church that tells us nothing. There are many of us now, because of the change in technology and everything, we know what's happening in the tablet, we know what's happening in the National Catholic Reporter. We learn more about what's happening in the church here with regard to Bishop Morris with those overseas publications, nothing in the Catholic Weekly about who's saying Mass at the Cathedral the following week and the routine. There's not much else. And I think we want to walk away with hope, but we want to speak with the bishops, we want to hear from the bishops, but we want the bishops to speak to Rome. We have Rome with a present pope and a previous pope who've given no justice to those men in the Legionnaires of Christ who were abused decades ago. We've heard so much about it and they've left it. And it seems to me that we are not going to see very much good happen in our lifetimes unless, especially as some of us are getting on, and it seems to me that unless we can make our bishops and the bishops of the world understand that they have to question Rome, I'm not sure where we're going.
Yeah. There are, several things that could be said. Firstly, the Catholic Weekly you mentioned. It actually carried an advertisement for this talk. Huh? Only once. Oh yeah, it cut it the next week, but it got it in once. How many of you heard about this talk through the Catholic Weekly? Hey, look at that, see? I know, and that was a mistake, but but it did. This big question, what we can do, is always, I'm asked it every time. I don't have any brilliant answers, other than to say, look, the bishops, every last one of them, before he's ordained a bishop, has to take an oath of loyalty to the Pope. Not to God, not to the church, not to the people of God, to the Pope. And they all take it quite seriously. So it's very difficult. I have many times been told that I have broken a solemn oath to God. I've been told that many times. And it's so, the chances of getting the bishops of the world collectively to confront the Pope are not very good. So what do I recommend? Well, two things. The one power that could change the church today is sexual abuse. Don't let it die down. Keep pushing all church authorities on that issue, because, they are, like everybody else, torn apart by the whole thing. They know it's a total contradiction of everything Jesus said. They know the real difficulties it's caused for them. And that issue needs to be kept alive, because nothing has the power to change the church as much as that does. Otherwise, the only other suggestion I can make is this. If you're looking for change, start with collegiality, and start with something very simple. There's a synod in Rome coming up in October. There is nothing to stop a bishop there saying, I've got a new suggestion. let's do everything we do normally here and vote on all the proposals that come up, but then instead of sending them over to the Pope, which is what they do now to write the document, let's send them out to all the bishops of the world to vote on, so that it will truly be the mind of the bishops. You know why that would be so radical? Because finally collegiality would be real. This would be the voice of the bishops, and even the Pope can't ignore that. Now, why do I suggest this, first of all? Well, for the very, very pragmatic reason, nothing more than pragmatic, that the Pope, if he's not listening to the bishops, he's unlikely to be listening to you. Am I right? So let's start with trying to get him to listen to the bishops. And there's a simple way of doing it. There's nothing... The Vatican will use modern technology to stop bishops doing things. You can get a fax, very quick, smart, saying, but they will not use technology to consult. And yet there's no reason why it can't happen. So push for collegiality, because if we get that, we've got our first step, and we can then get many other things going.
I want to thank you, first of all, Bishop Geoffrey, for this whole talk, and I thank Catalyst for giving us the opportunity to hear the bishop and to let him express what is so important. Secondly, I wanted to say I was struck again by the fact that power is the real problem, basic, as you stressed, along the sexual abuse, but it comes from that romance with power that the church has always seemed to practice. And that struck me in how selective it is. You mentioned that they use the natural law to stress about sexual sin. But when you think about the natural law applied to the sin of lying, that is, we have a voice box, and that voice box is there intentionally to let us express what is outside to someone, and to use it against that reason for its being in us is a sin. But has the church ever got excited about it? Do they talk about the sin of lying as being unnatural and mortal? And you never hear it. So they're very selective. They worry about the natural or not natural qualities of a sexual aspect, but not of other things. The second thing you said was about how marriage is love and procreation. Just think of all the church-sanctioned royal marriages down through the centuries that were all arranged with no love involved at all, probably not before or after, and the church never worried about that. So I think you've pointed out something very important, how selective the church has been in focusing on the sexual problem.
Well, no, I would never want to see the church, start talking about lying in terms of natural and unnatural acts. I mean, let's come away from that rather than go more to that. Once you talk about arranged marriages, you're into history and you're into culture. It's still a reality in many parts of the world. And then here I'm talking... almost heresy again, but again we've swung from one extreme to another. The arranged marriages had their really big problems, but the method of couples getting together today, can I suggest, also has its problems. Have we gone too far to an opposite extreme? Is there some room in between? I'm not going to suggest this too publicly, but where parents could have a role, not in picking and saying you must marry this person, but in, is there some better way than who you happen to meet at the dance or wherever? Don't ask me. Anyway, no, I think I'll stop there before I get myself into too much trouble.
Thank you, Bishop. This is a very simple question, and it's on the education question. How does this middle ground that you so beautifully presented, how is it being given to our young people? Because they're not here today. And how is it that they will get this message?
Oh, I don't know. It's one of the great difficulties, say, for teachers in Catholic schools these days. What do they say about sex? To simply repeat the hierarchical teaching, particularly in secondary school, is going to invite scorn. And yet, to say what I've said could invite condemnation. They're in a pretty difficult situation. Young people are doing their own thinking. I've found, by the way, that when I talk with a group of young people, they're open to what I'm saying. And they're even open to they're open to the idea, in other words, that you can't just say anything goes. There's got to be some morality about it. They're open to ideas, a discussion, a real discussion of a middle ground. So that, that way there can be, provided they're convinced that you're not coming simply to hit them with dogma, but you're actually listening to what they've got to say. It's not an easy conversation, by the way, but I think it is possible.
Bishop Geoffrey, thank you very much indeed for the whole talk. But I found your explanation there, the earlier part on the angry God and the perception of natural law. I think that was absolutely fantastic and explains a lot of what's happened. Moving further down the talk, where that middle ground was, one of the situations that occurred was the whole church approach to contraception, and the not universal but very largely accepted dismissal of contraception, and I think that probably has coloured very much the thinking of the young people, because it just made the church totally irrelevant. Yeah. Why would they listen to it? I think young people are far too rational. And if you can present rational reasons for things, they're very happy to address them. So, I've got no solutions to the problem, but rationality got to come into it.
You're right, of course. It was the issue of contraception that became the crucial issue. That was the one that caused all this change. And as I said at the very end, Humane Vitae was a watershed moment when the current just changed and went in a totally different direction. And we're not going back to a day when popes will just say, this is it, no reasons, my authority, and everyone will say yes and do that. You mentioned with the young people again, yes, you can talk with them at a rational level. I did add it's not easy. They will not want to change what they're currently doing and won't be open to too many arguments that might suggest otherwise.
Could I just suggest to Bishop Geoffrey that he publishes this talk somewhere, maybe in some magazine like The Swag or some other magazine anyway. There are not many options for that sort of type of talk in any other of our magazines here, unfortunately. Or could I suggest to him that it might be time for the bishop to write another book and incorporate all that into it? Thank you, Jeff.
Good, John. There are difficulties in publishing in print. There's another article that I had written on divorce, and I sent it to a periodical that I knew well, and they knew me, and I thought, suddenly I didn't hear another word from them. And I believe that what happened was that it had come to the attention of authorities in Rome, and they'd blocked it, its publication. And it's never been published anywhere else. The major possibility for an article like this is digital. So on a website, Catalyst, of Catalyst.
And Aquinas Academy.
And Aquinas Academy. It could go there, but to get it into print anywhere, it would not be easy. I've written another book. It's with the publisher, but it's not this one that's there. It's not controversial. It's entitled "The Gospel of Luke for Meditation and Homilies," and that should be out by the end of the year. Yes, I am thinking of another book in which a number of the articles that I've written come together and get published as a book, hopefully in a year or two.
I've read your book quite a lot, particularly the personal section at the beginning, and I have felt the pain of one person, and I know it's shared, and it's, there's a lot of suffering around in the same terms that you spoke of. The interesting thing about pedophilia, from my way of thinking, is it's a worldwide problem. And the Catholic Church put it in its pocket, sadly so, but never really with a great group of people like all the scout movements, the youth movements, the sport movements, any movement in the world. So that today young people are still not left with a clear statement that their body is their body and only their body, and nobody at all really has come out and said a whole lot and strongly. There's just been this discussion and the argument, and it's largely been a Catholic concern, and yet it's coming out all over the place. The other little observation, just in terms of masturbation, the gravely disordered. I've often wondered at the word gravely. I've thought maybe a terrorist act would be grave, maybe a bomb, a rape, a suicide, a murder, or just perhaps, the man and a woman with their own personal gift of sexuality, which is shared at some stage maybe, isn't something so beautiful that we oughtn't to think very, very differently about what we have as a gift, and so much of it's put. I think Thomas Aquinas was one to say it was gravely disordered. That's a long time ago. And probably he didn't have the same grave problems that there are today.
Yes, the gravely bit goes back to the same teaching that all sex is mortal sin. There's no such thing and nothing less than that. As regards pedophilia, thanks for making that comment. Yes, we're only at the beginning of it. We've still to realise that there's vast quantities of pedophilia outside of Catholic priests and brothers, that it occurs in families. In fact, half of all pedophilia occurs within families, and that it's rife throughout society. There are other countries overseas where it's. I know one Australian missionary in a South American country, and I asked him about pedophilia over there, and he said, incest is so rife, and the use of minors for sex is so rife that a little bit more from the local priest wouldn't attract the slightest attention. Yeah, now, we've still to face it in our own country, the sheer extent. In that sense, all the concentration on the Catholic Church has been a diversion. Now, I'm not objecting to, what happened within the Church was utterly wrong. And that priests should do it is something I still battle with. Really battle in my own mind. How could a priest do this? But it can also serve to camouflage that fact that there is vast quantities of sexual abuse of minors out there in the community. Our community and throughout the world. And, we still one day, as an entire community, have to face that. All right, thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much, Geoff. I understand that when you get into conversation, one of the outcomes is that there are no clear outcomes often, but it's the necessity, I think, we need to engage in it. I would characterise myself as a hope-filled pessimist. And Geoff, you've enhanced both this morning. But we've got to keep turning up. Our hope is not in the church. We are God-centred people. We are faithful because we have our own particular sense of vocation about that, and we do our best. But I must say I'm very pessimistic about what human beings can do and bring, and we must live with a sense of mercy and forgiveness. Geoff, once again, I think this is the best session I've ever been part of with you. This is, and I think it's the best public conversation I've been part of too. It's been wonderful. So thank you very much, Geoff. Geoff commented that one of the functions of age is he's losing his voice a little bit more. There's an irony in this, Geoff, because I think you're just hitting your straps, man. So, God bless you all, and don't forget the order forms. Pauline's at the back there, and thank you for your participation this morning. Can you email me?